Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Pat McCormick, City Club President, and I'd like to welcome members and guests alike, those of you who are joining us today at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. Today, U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley will discuss how we can save the American dream by reversing the decline of the middle class. But first, some announcements. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners ensures that we put on the state's best civic programs week after week. I'd like to thank our media partners, including Oregon Business Magazine, and our Friday Forum corporate sponsors for this winter, Bank of the Cascades, CenturyLink, Miller Nash, Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield of Oregon, and The Standard. We're grateful for your support and commitment to City Club's mission. Please join me in a warm round of applause for all of them. Join us next week when State Treasurer Ted Wheeler discusses priorities for building a strong workforce in Oregon and options to finance and bolster Oregon's economic competitiveness. The following week, members will be discussing and debating and voting on the City Club's ballot measure report on the fluoridation of Portland's water supply. The forum is open to everyone, but you must be a current City Club member to join the debate and cast a vote. City Club membership is open to everyone. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, the City Club will be live tweeting at this event. You can follow or mention us at pdxcityclub, and be sure to use the hashtag CityClub in your own tweets. We will be having a question and answer session with Senator Merkley at the end of today's program. Members, please come to the microphone, which will be up here in the front, to ask your questions. For all of our audience members, please locate the index cards at the center of your tables and write your questions on them during the forum. We will collect them prior to the start of the question and answer period. And now our program. The American dream is slipping away from the hopes of many Americans. It's true that the past few years have been tough economically for our country, but the reality is that the income inequality we are seeing in today's society has been a long time coming. Productivity has risen steadily since World War II, but wages have stagnated for more than 30 years, and the middle class is shrinking, and with it, the American dream. Senator Jeff Merkley will discuss investments and decisions that will lead to a better future for our children. Since his days interning for Senator Mark Hatfield, Jeff Merkley has been committed to fighting for Oregon's middle-class families, ensuring that everyone in Oregon has the opportunity for a good education, to find a job, and someday own a home. Making the American dream a reality for others is what got Jeff Merkley involved in public life and what continues to keep him fighting for Oregon families. In the 4 years he has been in the United States Senate, Jeff Merkley has been focused on creating jobs and getting our nation back on track. Please help me welcome Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and I saw quite a few of our city and county officials here, and so welcome to them, and a special welcome to the many folks who are in the overflow room today and couldn't be in here quite within line of sight. Very occasionally, my wife, Mary Soderberg, gets to join me at events, and it's rare, and this is one of those rare moments, and so I am delighted that she's able to be here today. The American dream is a dream deeply rooted in our history and in our founding documents, our founding Constitution. And if you have a nation that has abundant resources, if you have a nation determined to shake off the ossified class structure of Europe, if you have a nation with a government designed to be, as President Lincoln so eloquently stated, of the people, by the people, and for the people, With all that, how can you fail to have the conditions, the opportunity for every family to thrive? That vision of the American dream of opportunity, mobility, prosperity was deeply challenged by the Great Depression. Banks gambled their deposits on high-risk investments. Investments failed. Banks called in loans to cover losses. Families couldn't get new loans. Families were foreclosed on. Foreclosure swept the nation. Stock market crashed. Employment plunged. The days were very dark. The suffering was substantial. Yet it's in those dark days that the term American dream was coined. An American historian from New England, James Treslow Adams, in 1931 wrote a book titled The Epic of America, in which he set out to address the historic development and philosophical vision of the United States of America. It turns out he wanted to name his book The American Dream, but the editors thought nobody would like that term. And so he called it The Epic of America. And he wanted to examine the factors that make America uniquely America. He'd lived in quite a few other places in the world and therefore had a good context to explore that. He described the American dream as, and I quote, "a land in which life should be better and richer and fuller for everyone, with opportunity for each." That vision of opportunity for every American to thrive may have been difficult to fathom in 1931 when he wrote those words in the depths of the Great Depression. Many families have stories of what their parents and grandparents went through. My grandmother on one side of the family lived in a boxcar, took in laundry to survive. My grandparents on the other side lost their homestead to foreclosure. And I'm sure each of you has stories like that in your history. But America rallied under the leadership of Franklin Roosevelt. Together, the nation adopted and implemented Glass-Steagall and got banks out of high-risk investing and back into the critical role of making loans. We created deposit insurance to stop runs on the bank. We replaced callable balloon home mortgages with fully amortizing non-callable mortgages. We created the Civilian Conservation Corps to put folks back to work. We created the Securities Exchange Commission to clean up fraud on Wall Street and restore faith in investing in bonds and in stocks. We adopted a minimum wage. We established Social Security to provide retirement income for every working American. And America's rebound continued after World War II. A huge middle class emerged. Working families could buy a 3-bedroom ranch home in a suburb. Working families could afford a vacation. Working families could realistically save to help their children go to college. James Adams' vision of an America in which life is, quote, better and richer and fuller for everyone was very much alive. My family lived this American dream. My father was a mechanic. He worked with his hands. On his wages, he could buy that 3-bedroom ranch house. My mother could choose, and did choose, to be home with the kids because a family could thrive on a single working income. There were few luxuries in our household, yet my parents could encourage their children to go to college, assuring them that if they went, they could help make it financially possible. My parents believed, and I believed, that every generation in America will be in a position to do better than the generation before it. In 1970, when I was entering high school, we could believe that here in America, the child of a mechanic had roughly the same opportunity to thrive as the child of a CEO. So if the American dream was alive and well in 1970, 1960, even 1950, shouldn't it be even more so today with the fruits of another 40 years of invested productivity? So I ask you, I thought I'd just take a little poll. How many here today believe the American dream is alive and well? See a few hands. How many of you here believe that the American dream is in deep trouble? I see a lot more hands. For our radio audience, I'd say that was about 10 to 1. The American dream is in trouble. Some have started to call it a mirage. George Carlin joked that, quote, "It's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it." HBO recently aired a documentary filmed here in Portland, followed 8 families who are struggling through this recession. It's called The American Winter. Encourage folks to see it. These families were suffering from the loss of living wage jobs, from the impact of unanticipated medical expenses, and through the loss of homes through foreclosure. One father in the movie sums up the gap between the American dream and the reality for his family as follows. He says, "Forget the dreams. How do we make it tomorrow? Tomorrow is the dream. This dinner is the dream. If you can turn the lights on and turn the water on, that's a dream." So in America today, the American dream is in trouble, and families like those in American Winter being impacted by changes in the housing market, by the loss of living wage jobs, by unanticipated medical expenses are in trouble. Our middle class is in trouble. So how did we go wrong, and how do we get back on track? The problem is not that our national wealth has stagnated. Indeed, it has surged. In 1980, our collective national family wealth was about $10 trillion. Today, it's about $66 trillion, or the equivalent of $220,000 a person. But the distribution of income and wealth is becoming more and more skewed. From 1945 to 1974, the year I graduated from high school, workers' real wages increased steadily as their productivity increased. If you see a chart of this, you're really struck by the fact that the two lines of productivity increase and real wages for working Americans are right on top of each other. But in 1974, as I'm getting out of high school and heading off to college, the real wage line flattens out, and it remains flat for the next 4 decades. In fact, it goes down slightly in this last decade. So the result is not that we're seeing less wealth, but that more and more is going to fewer and fewer. The top 1% in America now own more than 1/3 of the total family wealth. The top 10% own 75% of America's wealth. What about the bottom 60%? Well, in 1970, they owned 6.4% of the national wealth. But today, it's 1/4 of that. They've lost 3/4 of their share of the national income. We see that in income, disparity continues to grow, with the top 10% bringing in 44% of the national income, and so driving that ongoing disparity. And if you're a minority in America, if you're Hispanic or if you're African American, the median wealth of your ethnic group is very low. For white Americans, it's $113,000. For a Latino family, it's $6,300. For an African American family, it's $5,700. Those numbers have come down substantially because of the recession we just had that wiped out a considerable amount of home equity for families that had more recently become homeowners. And in this Great Recession, turned into a modest, slow recovery, we see a little bit of insult to injury. That is, in the recession, 60% of the jobs we lost were living wage, middle income jobs. And in our recovery, 60% of the jobs gained are service, low wage jobs. The replacement of manufacturing jobs with service jobs has been going on for some time, but we see it accentuated in this last recession. In terms of manufacturing, the 10 years between 1958 and 1968, we added 4 million manufacturing jobs in America. In 1998 through 2012, so the last 14 years, we have lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and 40,000 factories. And those manufacturing jobs are critical to living wage positions in our economy. But what about economic mobility? Now, if families can readily go from lower income families to higher income families, then we know that there's a strong pathway in place, a staircase in place, a ladder. Well, unfortunately, mobility is low in America. 44% of Americans in the bottom 20% of income were born to parents in the bottom 20. 45% of Americans in the top 20% were born to parents in the top 20%. And study after study has shown that economic mobility is now lower here in the United States of America than it is in Europe. And yet, as we founded our nation and thought of the American dream, we thought we were setting behind that ossified class structure and economic immobility of the old country. So James Tressel Adams, who coined the phrase American Dream, went on to say this in the introduction to his book. He said, "Ever since we've become an independent nation, Each generation has seen an uprising of ordinary Americans to save that dream from the forces which appear to be overwhelming it. That is our collective challenge in our generation, to save the American dream from the forces that are overwhelming it. So I thought I'd lay out a few of the things that we should be working on. First, we need to direct a lot more resources to nation building here in the United States. And specifically, we need to end this war in Afghanistan and bring our sons and daughters home and spend that $120 billion here in the United States of America. If we took that $120 billion and spent $40 billion on education, and $40 billion on education, and $40 billion on reducing the deficit, we would create jobs, we would strengthen opportunities, and we would reduce the deficit. Multiple win strategy. Now, there are numerous pathways of poverty or low income into the middle class, but some are particularly powerful. And one is jobs, and one is education. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about those, and about home ownership, and about small business, because those four things comprise significant, powerful pathways into the middle class. Well, let me start by talking about one aspect of jobs, which is investment in infrastructure. China is spending 10% of its gross domestic product on infrastructure. Europe is spending 5% of its GDP on infrastructure. Anybody know how much the United States of America is spending? I hear 1%, little more than 2%. And yet a lot of that 2% goes to replacing the aging infrastructure we have left from World War II. Leaves little to expand and build additional infrastructure. So that is a challenge, and yet infrastructure spending would make a lot of sense right now because we have a construction industry that's been flat on its back, and the cost of funds is very low. Now, there are some aspects of investing in infrastructure that are particularly frustrating to me personally, and the infrastructure that we talk about isn't always in the context of big transportation projects, but let me give you an example. I proposed a bill called WIFIA, Water Infrastructure Act, modeled on the Transportation Infrastructure Act, which is very, very successful. We have counties and cities across our state that have the challenge of getting affordable funds to build clean water supplies and water treatment. Now, that's the type of infrastructure projects that would be dispersed all over the country. I'm happy to report that the WIFIA bill that I've authored has just come out of committee and has a very good chance of being passed through the Senate this year, so keep your fingers crossed. Another piece, and I should say anytime someone says a very good chance of being passed through the U.S. Senate, should adopt a little bit of a wait-and-see attitude. One of the things that I got very involved in my first 2 years in the Senate, and I've continued since, is low-cost loans for energy-saving retrofits. That's another form of construction infrastructure. It turns out that because you create a lot of middle-income construction jobs, because the labor cannot be outsourced, because 95% of the materials used are made here in America, there's virtually no leakage, that this is the most effective strategy dollar for dollar to create jobs in America. And so I partnered with Mark Warner on Homestar, which was renovations for the home. I was the lead on Building Star for commercial buildings. I was the lead on a program through our rural electrical co-ops called Rural Energy Savings Program, or Rural Star as we nicknamed it. And that bill made it in, the third one, made it into the Farm Bill, and the Farm Bill went over to the House, and the House never took up the Farm Bill last year, and it died. And here's how frustrating it is. Former President Bill Clinton came into our caucus. He spent 20 minutes talking about how the single most effective thing we could do, dollar for dollar to create jobs, was low-income loans for energy-saving retrofits on buildings. And I was trying to send him a mind signal. And now you can say, and Senator Merkley's been leading that effort back in the room. And no such luck. But how is it? How is it that such a powerful strategy has not found its way, while Republicans and Democrats are talking about jobs, has not found its way through to the Oval Office? Another piece we should think about in jobs is nurturing manufacturing. Last year I did a Made in Oregon manufacturing tour, talked to entrepreneurs and CEOs around the state, went on the floor, looked at what they were building, asked them how we could be helpful, what would make the conditions possible to make more here in Oregon. And they really talked about the investment in equipment, job training, and export promotion. And these are three critical elements that are now in the Made in America Act I'm co-sponsoring. Senator Gillibrand of New York is the lead sponsor on it, and I feel like this really goes right to the heart of things. And we should recognize that trade can be very powerful. Trade on a level playing field, and we need to fight for that, because on a level playing field, it can be a very powerful force for expanding manufacturing economy. On a tilted playing field, it can actually take away jobs. So that is the challenge we have. But we should remember this. If we do not make things in America, we are not going to have a middle class in America. So let's make things here. Another major pathway to the middle class is education. Our school years are getting shorter. My children are going to the same school district, David Douglas, that I went to from 3rd grade forward. And the school year, the number of days are shorter, and the class sizes are much larger. And in terms of extracurricular activities, there are now fees on them, and many working families cannot afford their fees, and therefore they're not able to participate in things that help keep them engaged in school, from extra art programs to sporting activities to drama and so forth. So we are not, and this is really true across the country, we are not doing as good a job providing K-12 education to our kids as our parents did for us. And that is not okay. It's not okay in a world knowledge economy where those nations that invest in education are going to have a better future for their children and be more competitive internationally and have stronger economy down the line. And then in higher education, we have a huge challenge because the cost has greatly exceeded the Consumer Price Index. In 1975, after I was out of high school and off to college, a student at the University of Oregon or Oregon State University could earn a year's tuition working full-time for a summer at minimum wage. Today, that summer job would have to pay twice minimum wage, and students can't find jobs that pay twice minimum wage. So that is not possible. So we have more and more students dropping out to try to save money. It's very hard to save money on minimum wage and be able to go back. We have students who are developing crushing debt loads, and just this last year, student debt became higher across the nation than total credit card debt. This is daunting and it's discouraging, and especially so if there aren't jobs there for when folks graduate. So this is the wrong way to go in a knowledge economy world, and we have to do better in making education affordable and launching our kids and our future economy. Well, let me turn to home ownership. Home ownership, another powerful instrument in folks moving into the middle class. Now, some say that this last recession shows that home ownership really is an unsuccessful tool and it shouldn't be encouraged for working families to become homeowners. We should become a renter society. They are absolutely wrong. Middle class wealth primarily is based on equity in homes. And what went wrong from 2003 to the crash in 2008 wasn't encouragement of home ownership. It was instead taking the classic amortizing home mortgage and converting it into a predatory teaser rate loan that doubled in interest, going from 4% to 9 or 10% after 2 years, and then building securities based on those predatory loans, securities that melted down and was a huge factor in taking the entire economy with it. I was determined to try to end some of the tactics in those predatory loans. So when I was Speaker of the House, we passed a bill in the House that said you can't have liar loans and you can't have prepayment penalties. Without prepayment penalties, teaser rates completely disappear. We didn't get that bill through the Oregon Senate, and the Senate had a good argument. They said, you know, this can only apply to state-chartered institutions. We should really do this at the federal level. So when I was elected senator, I set about to put these into the federal law, and in Dodd-Frank are those bans on liar loans and prepayment penalties that reestablish the mortgage as a responsible instrument for building middle-class wealth. We turn to small business. What I heard from small business across Oregon was the huge challenge of having access to capital. And one of the things that Congress did was to extend the 90% guarantee rate for small business loans, so community banks would do a lot of small business loans during this recession. But there were two other things that I became involved in. One was to establish the Small Business Lending Fund and to establish crowdfunding. Both of those made it to the President's desk. The Small Business Lending Fund, which helped community banks recapitalize who had reached a leverage limit and yet were trapped in the situation where the market had gone from exuberance to fear when it came to investing in community banks. And then crowdfunding. Now, crowdfunding should be up and operating right now, but the rules have not been completed yet, something that we see a lot of out of our regulatory agencies. But the concept here is that we can utilize the new powerful strategy on the web, which has been very effective in funding the arts and various nonprofit ventures, and it's also been powerful in terms of small business loans to small business capital formation. And I won't go into all the details now, but if just a small percent of what folks put into IRAs they were to put into crowdfunding, it would match all the small business lending that exists today across the country. And so it could be a significant factor in helping businesses launch their enterprises. Now, these pathways to the middle class have to be backed up by a functioning financial system and a functioning legislature. So let me talk a little bit about those two things. And how am I doing on time? I'm good, okay. Let's talk about banking. In the Great Depression, big banks decided to invest in high-risk efforts rather than making loans. And for a while that worked, and then the investments crashed, and then they were in deep trouble, and because mortgages were callable, they called them, and we have this cycle that I referred to earlier. Stock market crashed, families were foreclosed on, and so forth. If we fast forward to the 1980s and the savings and loan crisis, we have much the same thing. Deregulation, the savings and loans could invest in high-risk adventures. They did, they crashed, and the country ended up having to bail us out of that situation. And then if we fast forward to this last financial crisis, we see, again, banks taking and investing in high-risk ventures, including what became the toxic securities based on the predatory mortgages, and the country melted down when those investments went bad. After the Great Depression, one of the key strategies was Glass-Steagall. And Glass-Steagall said, you know what, banks that take deposits should make loans. Lending is essential. They shouldn't be in the business of high-risk investing. That's a hedge fund activity. If folks want to take their money and send it to a hedge fund manager and say, take a lot of risk, do it. But if you put your deposit into a bank, that should be lent back out, provide that liquidity to enable business and families to seize opportunities in America. And indeed, lending is essential for small business and individuals to seize opportunities and create jobs. I found myself, quite surprisingly, in a role that I hadn't anticipated in the U.S. Senate, which was to take a modern Glass-Steagall strategy proposed by Volcker, Paul Volcker. Volcker said the key firewall is between, not as Glass-Steagall put it, between insurance activities and loan making, but between loan making and high-risk investing, between traditional bank lending and hedge fund style investing. And so I put out an email to my colleagues saying, would anybody like to join me in trying to make this actually happen? And Senator Carl Levin of Michigan came up to me on the floor, and he said, I will join you in this. And my Truman Committee, subcommittee, which has investigated a fair number of the securities problems that emerged, will put that into the effort as well. And that is what we did. And against considerable odds, because there was great determination to block it, and the Senate's easy to block things, Carl Levin and I were able to get that put in during the conference committee on Dodd-Frank, and that firewall is enacted into law. Now, that firewall would prevent the sort of thing we just saw happen with J.P. Morgan. JP Morgan took American deposits. They set up a high-risk investing fund in Europe. One of the traders has become quite well known as the London Whale. They proceeded to make very risky bets, and those bets went down, and they lost $6 billion, and thank goodness they were a big enough institution that they didn't go under last year. But smaller institutions have and would again, and it's a reminder of the fact that if we don't get this firewall firmly into place, we are going to have this sort of situation occur again, where big banks go down and the government is going to have to decide, are we going to bail them out? So we had this whole discussion over too big to fail, and we set up funeral plans, which is a term for how you unwind a very complex financial institution. The plan is supposed to be laid out in advance so the government will not step in. But virtually nobody believes that that will really happen if a major institution goes down. And if you want a reminder of that, look at what has just happened with Shanghai Bank Corporation, HSBC. HSBC, huge financial entity, laundered hundreds of billions of dollars of funds. They stripped off their transactions, the indicators that would have caused those transactions to be stopped by their money laundering filter system that they were required to have. And they proceeded to launder money for the drug gangs of Mexico, for nations like Iran that we have significant foreign policy strategies in place to try to create pressure to end the nuclear program there, and to terrorist groups around the world. 40,000 people died in northern Mexico from drug activity that was facilitated by that type of money laundering. But our Attorney General came out a few weeks ago and said there would be no prosecution of any of the individuals involved in this massive money laundering scheme, no prosecution of the bank itself, because it would send tremors through the international financial system if our government pursued a prosecution against such a significant financial institution. So our Attorney General created a prosecution-free zone. And that is unacceptable in America. The first political act I took was when I was a junior in high school, and I came home and read the evening paper, and I read that Spyro Agnew had been convicted of taking bribes, and my memory was about $100 billion, and that he had received his criminal penalty, and his criminal penalty was a $10,000 fine. I said, well, what kind of a situation is that? He gets to keep 90% of the funds he's convicted of taking. That's not justice. That's not Lady Justice with a blindfold over her eyes. Well, so this HSBC situation on a much more vast scale. Now let me turn to fixing the Senate. And we need to fix the House too, but I'm in the Senate, so I'll talk to the Senate. I saw the Senate work when I was an intern for Senator Hatfield. I saw it work in the 1980s when I worked for Secretary Weinberger at the Defense Department and then for the Congressional Budget Office on strategic nuclear policy. It was a legislature that virtually everything was done by a simple 51 votes out of 100. That has completely changed. There was a courtesy, and the way it worked is everyone would have their say, and then someone would ask for unanimous consent, hold the vote, and they'd get that consent, except in very rare circumstances. To give you an example of this, Lyndon B. Johnson, during the 6 years that he was majority leader, had to file a petition one time in 6 years, to try to close debate when he didn't get unanimous consent. Harry Reid, during his first 6 years as majority leader, so not including the last 2 months, had to file 391 such petitions to try to close debate and get to a final vote. Now, it isn't just a matter of filing a petition, it's a matter of the time eaten up. Because if you've had a debate Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're on Monday, and it turns out that somebody objects when you say, okay, everybody's had their say, let's get to a final vote, and in 1 second a person says, I object, that's all it takes. On Tuesday, you file the petition. You can't vote on it until Thursday. Let's say you get the 60 votes needed to enact that petition, which is really a representation of a motion to close debate. Then you have to have an additional 30 hours of debate, so that takes you through to Sunday. So the 1 second objection on Monday has taken you through Sunday, a whole week is wasted. There are not 391 weeks in a 6-year period. So you start to see what a diabolical strategy this is. It reduces the Senate to being essentially kind of like slogging knee-deep through molasses. Thus, in the last 2 years of 24 appropriation bills that should have been done, 1 made it through the floor of the Senate. And so instead of appropriation bills, we find ourselves with continuing resolutions that keep expiring, and we go from careening from fiscal cliff to fiscal cliff rather than having an orderly process in place. And policy bills, rarely do they make it to the floor because of the little time that's left after all of this. So that is why I'm making the case that we must fix the broken Senate and we must fix the filibuster. Some very simple things. Get rid of the filibuster on the motion to proceed so you aren't debating whether to debate. Get rid of it on going to a conference committee. Both sides have already passed a bill. Let's get that conference committee started. Let's proceed to change it from 60 votes to end debate to 41 to extend debate, which means the folks who are absent count on the other side of the ledger, which a little bit is helpful. And then should 41 say they want more debate, they should have to debate. They should have to stand before their colleagues and make their case and spend the time and energy and be accountable and let the American people and their colleagues say you are a hero or you are a bum. Because that type of feedback could get things passed. We had the Disclose Act related to Citizens United so that all political donations would have been transparent. We got 59 votes twice. We couldn't get the 60th vote. If folks had had to have a talking filibuster so that America could see that they were protecting secrecy, we would have gotten that 60th vote, and we'd have that transparency today. And I think that would be true in many things that are in the public interest. If you think about it, Franklin D. Roosevelt, if he had been facing that kind of paralysis from a minority, we wouldn't have gotten a whole long list of things that I described that put us back on track as a nation. And this paralysis is feeding cynicism by our nation as a whole and by our young folks who aren't looking to government to say we can solve our problems and move forward. They're looking to paralysis and saying, well, I guess we're stuck. I'm stuck with high student loans, no jobs, nothing's happening to remedy the situation. And that frustration is just a rot in the core of American public life that we need to end. The American dream is rooted deeply in our economic capacity, in our vision of high mobility, in our vision that we have the resources and the means for any family to be able, that works hard, to be able to have a strong foundation. We can respond as James Tuslow Adams proposed and save that dream from the forces which would appear to be overwhelming it. We want a strong future for our children. We want a strong economy for our nation. So let's get busy. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator, for addressing this pressing issue of our time. And now, for those in the audience, if you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so that City Club staff can collect it from you. Thank you. The first question for our speaker will be from our Friday Forum host, Karen Curvin. Karen is the Chief Marketing Officer at Schwabe Williamson & Wyatt, where she oversees the firm's client relations, marketing, and public relations, as well as business development activities. She's been a City Club member since 2003 and currently serves as Secretary of the Board. Karen?
Thank you, Senator Merkley. My question is going back to the point that you touched on about income. How would you change the current tax code to foster greater income equality without adversely impacting economic growth?
Yes, thank you. There are a couple things. First is 30 of our largest, most successful companies in the country pay zero tax, and yet they use vast amounts of infrastructure. So there needs to be some form of minimum tax related to the economic activity of companies to compensate for the fact that so much infrastructure is employed. I would also take and have a thorough examination of essentially wasteful spending in our tax code. It was 1986 that our own Senator Packwood proceeded to overhaul the tax code, the loopholes and deductions. Hasn't been done since, 27 years. So there is a lot of wasteful spending there. And if you take each of those tax loopholes and you were to close it, the ones that are in fact wasteful, and you were to send a third to infrastructure and a third to education, a third to the deficit, we could repeat the vision that I was laying out for shutting down the war in Afghanistan. And that would put a lot of people to work and allow a lot of money to be invested in the success of families through the creation of more manufacturing jobs and infrastructure investments.
Senator, we will now take questions from the floor. As always, we invite City Club members to the microphone to ask their question. Asking questions at a Friday forum is a privilege of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, identify yourself as a City Club member, please. And please only ask one question, and ask your question as succinctly as possible. If I flash this little question mark card, it means please wrap up your question.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. Some of the manufacturing job loss has not been because of offshoring, but because of sunk costs of infrastructure that no longer is appropriate in 20th century time cycles for manufacturing. Is there some investment that is being looked at or could be done at the federal level on new types of manufacturing that could come to scale faster and less expensively and come down less expensively so that we're not trapped in a cycle of sunk cost?
Yes. Well, a couple things, Virginia. The first is that the experts on those types of investments are our entrepreneurs, are our companies that are involved in manufacturing. But one of the things that they thought would be quite helpful was accelerated depreciation, which allowed them to reach out, find and identify the equipment to replace that old equipment that you're referring to, and get it on board now. One of the challenges that we have, or it's really a conundrum, is that there is a fantastic capability that has been unleashed by modern robotics and modern computers and modern sensors, which can replace a lot of the work that individuals do. Now, our companies, to be competitive in the world, really have no choice to pursue these types of technologies, but we also have to recognize that that reduces, for any given amount of manufacturing, it does reduce the amount of jobs that are created. And I found in my conversations around the state with CEOs and production managers, several of them raised this conundrum, that they had been anticipating this change, but they also knew it was going to replace some of the humans that were working, some of the citizens who were working on their production line. So I just wanted to throw that in as an additional challenge that we have.
I'm Judy Farmer, a City Club member, a grassroots volunteer with Organizing for Action, and one of your supporters. Thank you for your service to the people of Oregon and to the United States as serving as our U.S. Senator. My question is off topic on this, but I would like to know your position on the legislation to have a universal background check on all sales of firearms in the United States. And my other question is, what is your position on banning military-style assault weapons? Thank you.
Thank you, JD. On the background checks, when I was first in the legislature, we had an assault at Thurston High School. This was 1999. And if I recall right, the Oregon Senate passed a background check bill, but we couldn't get it to the floor in the House, and then we tried to pull it out of committee, and we lost. And then it came to the floor, but someone moved to send it back to committee, and again we lost. And then so nothing was done. And then the citizens of Oregon turned around and put an initiative up and adopted by initiative background checks for gun sale shows. And that was a very significant effort and action by the citizens of our state. And I have been doing a lot of town halls. I've done, I think, 22 this year. And one reason I wanted to get out there early in the year and do them was because I wanted to hear feedback from folks. And largely in those town halls, background checks resonate. People feel like they are a reasonable strategy to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and out of the hands of the mentally disturbed. So I support universal background checks, and we'll be supporting that bill. You also asked me about assault weapons, and this is an issue that I'm struggling with Because to me, the test is, on the one hand, what will be consistent with the Second Amendment and what will be effective. The studies of our former assault weapon ban are not encouraging. And if you look at why, the reason why is essentially semi-automatic weapons are semi-automatic weapons. They may have a different form of grip. They may have a different type of folding stock. But in general, a semi-automatic is a semi-automatic. And so if you say, well, we're going to let these semi-automatics be sold, but not these that have these different stocks and different grips, there's not an inherent case that they will make a difference. Plus, there's a huge number already in circulation. But I think something that would be much more effective is to limit the size of magazines. And so I will be clearly and emphatically supporting such a limit on magazines. You know, in Oregon, if you're hunting deer, you can have 5 bullets. Ducks, I think it's 3 shotgun shells. I think a smaller magazine is very reasonable.
Yes, sir.
Senator, my name is Bill Harris. I'm a City Club member. We have a growing, broad-based interest, not extremely well publicized, in promoting a constitutional amendment that would make corporations not people and money not speech. In the scenario that you have presented, it seems to me likely that having that change of circumstance in the way our society does business and does government would be a major player. Would you comment on how that fits into your topic today, the restoration of the middle class or of quality life and opportunity in America?
Yes. There are really 3 strategies being discussed to try to take on the issue of the large unidentified funds that can flow into campaigns. And we saw a good demonstration of the impact from this recent presidential campaign. And if you were to take, for example, a very profitable company, and I pick on them only because they are very profitable, Exxon Corporation. In 2008, if they had put 3% of their net profits into the presidential campaign, it would have matched all of the donations to presidential campaigns on all sides by everyone else in America. That's an enormous, enormous leverage. I think of it as a stadium sound system that can drown out the voice of working Americans, of all Americans, really. And if you were to have that same question for 2012, the answer would be that the same company, if they had donated $1 out of $20 or 5%, they would have matched everything. That's out of net profits. Would have matched every dollar put in by everyone else in America into the presidential campaigns. So it is a huge threat to government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So one approach is the Disclose Act, which I mentioned. Another is to require companies to basically hold stock owner votes. The stockholders own the company, require them to vote on political donations, if you will. And a third approach is the constitutional approach that you described. There are 2 constitutional approaches under serious consideration. One of them is corporations are not people and money is not free speech. And the second is an explicit statement that Congress can pass laws regulating the donation and spending of campaign funds. I'm inclined to support both approaches, but I do caution that a constitutional amendment is an extraordinarily steep hill to climb. So we should have that discussion, but we shouldn't overlook other strategies while we're having it.
Kurt Wavering, member. You mentioned Afghanistan. You probably would also have mentioned Iraq if you were going to talk more about foolish wars that we get involved in. My question is, how can we reduce the power of the military-industrial complex that uses up so much of our money in war?
Yes. Well, it starts by being willing to have a public conversation about it, because here is the thing. When I talk about the fact we're spending way too much money on foreign wars and foreign bases and the full industrial military complex, folks get a little nervous because it's such easy to set yourself up for attack as being weak on national security. But I think that if we continue to underinvest in education, if we continue to underinvest in infrastructure, then we are going to systematically undermine our future economy, and that will be a profound impact on our national security. So I'm willing to have that argument. And let's carry it forward and look at some details. If you look at largely what we've been doing in Afghanistan, which this nation-building strategy there, it doesn't work. And I was really struck by, I arranged for 6 Pashtun leaders to come and meet me in Kabul. And they came from various tribal areas and came in and they made their say, and each of them said something along the lines, please don't keep building a strong central government. And then I said, isn't it the case that in your different areas that government is going to help you build roads, build healthcare clinics, build schools, build water systems? And they said, Senator, you don't understand. Here in Afghanistan, every single position in the government is sold, from the governorships on down, and people do not buy positions to serve. They buy them to exploit. So the bigger government you build, the more exploitation we face. That kind of turns the whole model that we're pursuing on its head. So I went to the ambassador that night and I said, this is what the tribal leaders said. Is this right? And he said 100% right, even down to school teachers who buy the positions and sell the grades. Very different world. And I could go on and on with other aspects. But our strategy has not served our national security well there. And we have many legacy programs going back to World War II and to the Cold War that need to be trimmed back. We had a defense secretary, a Republican, who served under Bush and served under Obama, who said there are $75 billion in defense procurement programs that don't do a dime or a drop for national security and should be ended. We should end them. So there is a lot of waste and rethinking, because the path we're on right now, we are falling behind the rest of the world in building our nation and building a strong future, strong American dream for the next generation.
Senator, let me ask one of the written questions. Can we effectively stop tax breaks for American companies which move their factories to foreign countries under current trade agreements?
So the question is, can we effectively stop the tax breaks? There are some that are pretty straightforward, and I'll give you an example. If you borrow money in the U.S. to fund construction of a foreign factory, the interest on that loan is tax deductible. That's a pretty straightforward piece. Other pieces get into a much more complicated system. And so we would, and I'm not a tax expert, so I'm going to say, as I've looked at them, those become more difficult. Some are easier, some are more difficult. But one thing that absolutely has to be done is we need to take on this strategy of putting corporate headquarters in basically tax havens and then manipulating intellectual property so that all the profits of the American company ends up in the Cayman Islands or somewhere else. That is a huge, huge factor. And this is where Carl Levin, my partner on Merkley Levin Volcker Firewall, this is where his committee has spent much of the last year. And they've laid out a pretty clear plan to take that on, and I think that's absolutely doable.
Good afternoon, Senator Alan DeWitt. I'm a new City Club member. My question is, what specifically has to be done to restore the 51 simple majority rule in the Senate?
Yes. So the Senate has never had a previous motion, except in its first few years, and then because of courtesy, they never needed it. So when they rewrote the rules, they threw it out. And thus, they found themselves in the situation of depending upon a social contract of courtesy. And of course, that wasn't always honored. As I mentioned, Lyndon B. Johnson had to file a petition once, but only once, to shut down debate. I have not looked, but I assume that was over Voting Rights Acts. I'd have to go back and check it. But largely, the courtesy was honored because the sense was that you as an individual, unless it's something enormously profound to your value system or your state, that you didn't really have the right to stop the entire 100 Senate chamber from moving forward and addressing the issues facing America. So we are not going to restore the same social contract that we had 30 years ago. When I was first around the U.S. Senate in 1976 as an intern for Senator Hatfield, I was assigned to a bill that came up on the floor, which was the Tax Reform Act of 1976. And I watched amendment after amendment be debated, and there was no television, there was no email, so I would run down and meet Senator Hatfield, as would other staffers with their senators, and brief him on the amendment, what was going on back home about it, what the arguments were pro and con. I just saw the Senate operate as a simple majority body. What those senators had served in World War II together. They could disagree without demonizing. All of America was less split ideologically. You had three networks bringing the national conversation together, a situation where you don't have that same force bringing the national conversation together. And folks had relationships between their families because they lived in D.C., and that changed as modern air travel enabled folks to return home for the weekend and have their families in their home states. So we aren't going to get the same exact set of circumstances, and we keep wanting to simply restore the social contract. We're not going to get there. That was the deal Harry Reid struck 2 years ago in January of 2011, and it didn't work. That's why I'm specifically saying we have to greatly constrain the opportunities and the rules that where you can, in fact, object to a simple majority vote on the motion to proceed, on getting to conference committee. It's why we need to shorten that week that I described, where a simple objection on Monday takes you through Sunday, even if you have the votes. That needs to be squeezed down from a full week to maybe a couple days. And we need to specifically change the language so that it is 41 to extend debate, putting those who are absent on the side of shutting down debate, and then require them to speak. And if you wanted to see an example from 2 weeks ago, we had a filibuster of a judge for the D.C. Circuit, extraordinarily qualified, and she was filibustered, but you didn't see it. You didn't see anybody standing up and filibustering. It was the new traditional, the new non-traditional silent filibuster. And then you had Rand Paul, who said, you know what, I am going to stand up before my colleagues and make my case. And he did a talking filibuster, in which he slowed things down and with a specific request in mind, but he was willing to stand before his colleagues and the American people on drone policy and make his points. So those are the key changes that I think would take us far in the right direction, and then see how those work and decide if we have to do more. The key, though, is that they still leave in place the ability of somebody who's willing to make their case and spend time and energy to do a filibuster, which makes it politically possible to get this done, and it takes away the argument that the minority viewpoint is being suppressed or minority rights are being taken away, which they're not. And that's why virtually every editorial board in America that weighed in on this weighed in favor of the reforms that I was proposing. So I'd say let's get those in place and try them out.
Witherell and City Club member. My question has to do with education. How are we going to restore the funding in education so that every student with their individual talents, capacities, and challenges can thrive in school and be measured to be thriving in ways that go beyond standardized tests, even if it includes standardized tests? What are we going to do to get schools back on track with really good talents and funding all the way through and be recognize that the quality of schools is not just test scores?
Great. Thank you, Carol. And it's a combination of local, state, and federal funding. And you were referring primarily to K-12 here?
Yes.
Yes. And the more we learn, she mentioned she was referring to pre-K, the more we learn about the circuitry of our brains and what happens in early childhood, the more important we understand that early involvement of children, being read to, being held, being talked to, being sung to, and then working with our kids when they're very tiny with their numbers and letters is very, very powerful. It puts them a long ways ahead before they get into kindergarten, if you will. And it's why Head Start has been so powerful. But the more we learn even earlier, makes a difference, which takes more resources, not less. And here in the state, if you look at the portion we spend on education, it goes up because we took a transition from the local school district where local property tax funded it. We had a property tax revolt and it went to the state. But then the state is spending a lot more money on prisons. You know, I think the number that it costs about $30,000 a year to put a person in prison in Oregon. And right now, the state legislature is looking at the penalties we assess for nonviolent crimes to try to say, is that the best strategy? Would it make more sense to have someone in their home with an ankle collar on them and limited rights of movement rather than paying $30,000 to have them? And if that is true, that it makes more sense to do that, then we have $30,000 more to put into education, and so on and so forth. So reworking the available funds we have in our system to try to move them into education. Wouldn't it make sense to spend a lot more money on the front end in education and a lot less money on the back end when the poor education system results in a lot more people getting in trouble and getting arrested and going to jail?
We have run out of time for further questions, and we'll have to stop for the day. Please join us next week when State Treasurer Ted Wheeler will discuss how we can build a better Oregon. And as we close for today, please join me in offering our sincere thanks to U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley. Thank you. We are adjourned.